everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Center for Sustainable Business Strategy Primer. Let's see if I can share screen and get this up really quick. All right, there we go. For those joining us online, please go ahead and share in the chats your name, say hello. We'd love to hear who you are, where you're from. This is a participatory type of conversation, and love to see that this is already one of our larger gatherings. In today's conversation, we're thinking about the metrics that we need to assess whether we're making progress in this just transition. And we'll be joined today very briefly by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So thank you again, Professor, for fitting us into your schedule today. Also joined by Vanessa Miler-Fels from Schneider Electric and Carolina Narich from Accenture. The piece that just for folks for conversation today, why we thought that this would be relevant conversation is that 2 years ago, we launched the Marshall Plan for Middle America, the roadmap. And since then, there have been a lot of conversations about metrics and about environmental, social governance factors. So companies have a lot of different stakeholders to think about, from investors, consumers, governments, boards, employees. I know that we just finished up COP27. We're about to go into the biodiversity COP. And so there's a lot of moving happenings around in this space. And so we thought it would be an apropos time to really bring everyone together and think about this. Before diving in, I should mention just upfront, long before there was a city of Pittsburgh or a University of Pittsburgh, our region was populated by indigenous peoples. So we want to acknowledge that the land our community occupies was once the home to the Adena culture, the Hopewell culture, Monongahela peoples, and others. The history of our region documents that these communities established a presence representing the oldest recorded civilizations in North America. So we want to recognize the thriving societies that they built that lasted for generations. And by becoming aware of and respecting the histories of indigenous peoples in the US and around the globe, people can learn to not repeat what has happened in the past while working towards the future in which we respect, revere, and live in harmony with the people who were first here, as well as the future generations we are borrowing this land from. With that, go ahead and Professor Sachs, welcome you to the floor. Would love to hear any and all thoughts that you have for helping us frame the conversation for today.
Great, thank you very much. Chris, thank you also for starting that way with the acknowledgement of the indigenous populations, which we don't hear enough in the United States, even though we were a nation of nations, and we don't learn about that, or I didn't as I was growing up. And I really appreciate that if we can put this back into our current culture, at least we will begin to have some understanding and make amends and do better in the future. So first, I want to appreciate your important opening. Unfortunately, I'm on just long enough to wish everybody happy Thanksgiving, and because my schedule changed for this afternoon, so I have to run. But I am just back from COP27, and I wanted to give a couple of minutes of reflection to where we are and what this means for the great work that you're doing and the plans for Middle America. I think that the upshot of the COP this time was a basically worldwide demand. Let's get serious and actually finance this transformation that we know we need. So there was no pushback at all on urgency. The COP was mainly dominated by the voices of developing countries saying, this is great, it's important, but the rich world has not provided the financing to make this possible. And I thought in this sense, it was very salutary. Of course, the single biggest announcement was that there will be some kind of losses and damages fund established, but as usual, another year of discussion. So perhaps at COP28 in the Emirates next year, something will be launched. The U.S. Special Envoy, John Kerry, Secretary Kerry, came and said we should work with the voluntary carbon markets. And he was a little bit booed off the stage, I would say, in a sense, because the rest of the world does not want to hear voluntary from the U.S. The rest of the world wants to hear money on the table. And I think it's just important for us to have that framing. But here we're talking about the U.S. actions, and compared to previous sessions with your great work that I've been part of, at least we have some legislation right now that's probably going to do something with the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the worst named pieces of legislation imaginable, but it basically is tax credits to incentivize the shift to green technology, and together with some other legislation to build American capacity for the industrial base for the green economy. And this is quite interesting. There are two parts of the transformation, I would say. One part is that our energy system should be a zero emission energy system, and our industrial base should be non-polluting, and that's where the circular economy comes in. But the second dimension is who's going to build the solar modules and the wind turbines and the hydrogen hydrolyzers and other things that are the new physical or the new manufacturing base for the new energy system. And the idea of the US transformation is supposedly we're going to decarbonize the energy system, and we will produce the underlying technologies and the machinery to actually carry that out, which is pretty good, although it also is worth noting that it's already opened up a lot of controversy with the rest of the world, because it's pretty clear that the Inflation Reduction Act violates WTO rules pretty flagrantly, I would say, because the whole point of this industrial policy is US preference, which is a kind of basic no-no in the international trading system. So even our closest friends in the European Union are saying we're going to take you to court in WTO over this industrial policy strategy of the US, because it's going to suck out production from Europe or elsewhere for making this underlying physical machinery and PV and other components of the clean energy system. So just to say that all of these trade issues and the global ramifications of these trade issues will be part of a debate. And it's also right to say that just as COP27 highlighted the lack of a financing strategy, we don't really have clarity on trade policy and industrial policy from a global systemic point of view right now. WTO rules were not written for decarbonization. They were written in a previous generation. Everybody has some kind of industrial policy now, but what are the proper limits of that? What should we be promoting in terms of trade in PV or trade in strategic minerals or trade in other technologies, and what part should we be reserving for our own industrial base will be the subject of a lot of discussion, debate, and contention in the years ahead. So I just want to flag that. My basic feeling about this question of metrics and where we're going starts with one idea which I've long held and continue to hold, which is to get this done properly, whether it's within the United States or globally, we need a clear game plan of what the transformation really looks like in a quantified perspective with a 25-year time horizon. And for me, it is similar to my youth because I was born in 1954, and in 1955, the Highway Act, Interstate Highway Act, was passed in the US. And that was a major act of building the infrastructure of the highway system. And most of my youth in my neighborhood in Michigan was devoted to huge debates about which mile road the highway would pass, and whether it would eliminate the golf course or the zoo or other local features. But the point was, there actually was a national map, and we were filling out the map. It took 30 years of construction, but we built an interstate highway system. And already back in 1955, there was a map of what we were going to build. And each administration continued the building. The funding came automatically from gasoline taxes, basically. And we built a highway system. We need something like that now, a roadmap of what our energy system's going to look like and how it's going to be produced. We don't have that yet. What we have from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is a lot of tax credits. But our government doesn't like to make plans. We don't have a planning ministry, unlike many other countries. We don't have a place where plans would be produced. Closest would be perhaps the Department of Energy or our national laboratories, but they're not really making plans, and the politicians don't want to see plans like that. So in this sense, we don't have metrics that are as helpful as they could be because we don't actually have a framework to judge. And I continue to hope that we'll have such a framework, but our politics around all of this are so fraught that what the politicians agree to is tax cuts of one form or another rather than an actual plan of decarbonization. Because everybody loves tax cuts or tax credits, and half the Congress doesn't like decarbonization to begin with. So they kind of compromised, okay, we'll give you tax credits, but no plan. So what would a plan actually entail? Some countries are making plans. It would entail a scenario of how we're going to get to net zero emissions, how we're going to have a clean power grid before we have a clean energy system, because the general idea is that by 2035 or 2040, the power sector is going to be substantially decarbonized. And then 10 years later, the harder industrial base, heavy industry, heavy transport, other things will step by step be decarbonized. For metrics, it would really help us to have a scenario like that so that we could judge against the scenario. Are we on track? Are we really making progress? Is the IRA actually delivering the pace of investments? And then similarly, on the industrial production side, are we producing enough solar modules? Are we building our solar industry? Are we building our hydrogen industry at a pace that is consistent with this overall vision? So maybe CSB could help to do that, and help to do that together with the national labs, which are really good. NREL and others do have partnerships. They do have scenarios. They're not our government scenarios per se, but they are our national laboratory scenarios. So I think academia could help to build some of these scenarios that the politicians don't quite want to build. Then there is one more component, very important, and that is the social dimension to the transformation. There are a lot of things to be said about that, but one is we are supposed to be keeping track of jobs, jobs lost and jobs gained, and the quality of the jobs, whether they're unionized jobs, whether they are in high quality work and so forth. So we have a lot of social accounting to do. And then there's, of course, a lot of discussion about social justice and climate justice, because a lot of the previous investments were pollution in minority communities, and absolutely sticking the dirtiest stuff in the poorest communities and so forth. Now we're trying to clean up, but we should be tracking the social consequences, both in terms of employment, community or local economy development, because that's part of the promise, and with an eye on racial justice as well, because our whole history of environmental policy has been racial injustice of a very deliberate sort at all scales. So there's a lot of metrics to make. The framework that we're operating in is sustainable development, which means combining the social dimensions with the environmental dimensions. We need, therefore, I think, to have a timeline to build the metrics. We don't have them right now. I think it's a good job for academia, because, again, the politicians won't quite do it, but we need it done. And I think CSB has a huge role to play in that, and happy to help. Just not this afternoon, unfortunately, because now I really do have to run for a late meeting. But thank you very much for having me. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody, and we'll follow up.
All right, Professor Sachs, thank you so much. Much appreciated, and happy Thanksgiving to you.
Thanks.
Enjoy the holiday. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, with that primer, we've teed up a lot of conversations around, a variety of metrics. So without further ado, we'll bring the rest of our panel into the conversation. So first up, Carolyn, welcome you to the stage, and Vanessa, you as well. So I know each of you from your respective backgrounds deal with a lot of metrics, and there's a lot of conversation around, are the metrics that we have enough? Are the 250 odd SDG indicators all that we need? Do we need more? Do we need less? Is profit the right North Star for companies? So I'd be curious on your thoughts, your experiences, especially with the priming that Professor Sachs provided. So he did touch on industry quite a bit. So Vanessa, maybe we start with your experience from Schneider Electric. Would love to see what your thinking is. And before teeing it over, just to tee up for the audience, I saw a couple of folks sending in through the chats. By all means, please do continue to do so. The first option in there is just to the panelists. So if you're trying to say hello to everyone else, make sure you flag to everyone. And also, please do feel free to submit questions. We did receive a handful in advance that we'll be collating from, but we'll also be looking for any questions that that we receive live. By all means, feel free to throw those into the Q&A function as well. But with that, Vanessa, your experience, your thoughts on the metrics that we need.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, it's quite hard to speak right after Professor Sachs, but I'll try to do my best to keep you, all as kind of excited as you was going through a lot of very interesting ideas. I mean, one that struck me is when he said the WTO was not written for decarbonization, and obviously a lot of corporate financing reporting or corporate finance reporting in general was not written with decarbonization or any social and kind of greater good impact in mind. And for too long, I think we had a lot of metrics that were forgotten, and Professor Sachs talked about, still needing metrics and still needing plans. Obviously, for me, it talks to negative externalities. For very long, most companies and most of the society were not able to incorporate or kind of factor in a decision-making negative externalities. But I think this has changed with ESG reporting. And the most important too is ESG reporting is not just voluntary. We're kind of really entering this new phase where a lot of ESG is going to become mandatory. And so that will require a lot more scrutiny around the metrics that companies have to report on. And it really makes kind of these external or negative externalities more visible when they weren't visible and when factored into the market before. The second one is, even though we're starting to have metrics, they're still kind of very, very nascent. And I think, well, that's where we're really looking to collaboration between private, public, academia, as Jeffrey Sachs said, to come up with the right metrics and to kind of improve our methodologies. But I would say the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. We should get going on climate and kind of managing our sustainability impact globally, while improving the data and the metrics we build our decision or our policies upon.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. And I love the idea of not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's start, let's iterate, let's prototype, let's get going in this on a variety of fronts, carbon and others. So with that, Caroline, would love to welcome you into the conversation as well. Obviously, Accenture advises a lot of companies in this space to try and figure out how to navigate. And I know that you've done some work with the World Economic Forum and others to try and figure out pathways forward. So what's been your experience thinking about the metrics that we need to focus on in order to know, are we making progress in this this just transition?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I almost kind of think about it on sort of two levels, right? So there's one, which is kind of the core kind of metrics, GHG protocol, all of the kind of core things that are incredibly complicated to measure. And we need to find pathways to do that, to compare, to make sure people have the tools, that companies have the systems to actually capture that data to begin with, right? So there's that whole kind of bundle there, which is really gets very granular very quickly. I think the other piece of the metrics, which is interesting and which Professor Sachs touched on as well, is kind of the broader framework that we have to be thinking about this round. And he started kind of touching on a couple of points in terms of like the social dimension, as well as obviously the transition to net zero. And the way that we think about it, and that we have been kind of advising clients to think about it as well, is really thinking about this kind of whole systems approach. So working with the World Economic Forum, we created this system value framework, which really looks to go beyond cost to really capture some of those other dimensions, right? So thinking about jobs, thinking about equity, thinking about health, but also thinking about the system itself, right? So Professor Sachs talked about we need to first get to a clean grid, right? Well, that also requires incredible amounts of flexibility as we bring more renewables into the system. It also requires a huge amount of resiliency, especially when you kind of then layer on the whole, climate impacts, as we see with extreme weather events and other things, right? So being able to kind of create that framework, which starts to capture some of these broader dimensions that we need to be thinking about, so that we can start making balanced choices around which pathway, and that we can do it in as just a way as possible. So we created that framework, and then we've actually used it to analyze different markets in terms of where they are on the transition. And what's interesting is that, different markets, certain things are more important to others, right? Like I live in California. Water is incredibly important, right? So we can't just make energy decisions without thinking about the water aspect. Whereas and flexibility, the more renewables you have, the more flexible your grid needs to be. Whereas in other markets that are just earlier in the transition, you need to actually just focus on build, right? Like generation build, right? And that's where the other point that Professor made in terms of the manufacturing becomes so critical as well. So different dimensions will be important at different times for different stakeholders, but I think it's really having that broad framework of what is going to be important as we transition is really critical, and aligns well with then have the roadmap that you can measure yourself against, right?
Yeah, and that lines up kind of, I think, really well with one of the things we were talking about in the green room, and that we've hosted here before in conversation with Professor Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. One of her points with the construction they've done in Wales was around involving public health officials when they're building out their mobility, their transportation plans. Because if you're just building it for like moving units of humans from point A to point B, you only think about certain things. But when you start involving other stakeholders, you start bringing in more of those societal components that you're mentioning, and that Professor Sachs teed up as well. Caroline, what's, or actually, sorry, Vanessa, in your experience, thinking about it from the company side, how have you? This is a lot of stuff to juggle, right? Most managers have a profit and loss sheet that they're trying to organize against, and then all of these other factors that we're asking them to try and organize towards. So what's been your experience in trying to figure that out? What works, what doesn't? Is there an example of a way that you're finding forward and you might not have found perfect yet, but thinking about people on the ground, what does that look like so we make this a little bit less abstract and more practical for folks?
I think Professor Sachs it was we need a plan. And this is really what has been asked from everyone, whether it's at a corporate level or at a country level. And so I think there are useful tools out there to kind of start to have plans. So there's obviously the science-based target initiatives that Mike Schneider joined, and we signed for net zero targets by 2030, 2040, and 2050. So basically that's what they're asking for. It's like you need a short, mid, long-term plan. Without a plan, we don't know where we're going. We don't, but the challenge with that obviously is that as all these plans are being developed, do they add up? And I think this is where we have to be really careful, and we're being very careful at Schneider too when we're talking about, okay, a company may be net zero, but that doesn't mean the world is on a net zero path, or a country may be net zero, like we talked a lot about the US. That certainly doesn't mean the world will be net zero. I mean, if the US shows the path, it definitely helps a lot of countries kind of come around. But it's, as you said, Caroline, it's going to be different pathways for different countries or for different companies. And so it's really like having that, being able to share transparently around those pathways, being as transparent as possible is really critical. But then the other piece, I mean, you all mentioned, is these plans are not just going to be enough. Like you can't just have metrics and be like, okay, we need, for example, we committed to reduce our CO2 footprint by 25% absolute by 2030. That's kind of a target. That's not a plan. In fact, if I have to be very specific, that's a target. That's not a plan. And then when you need to kind of get to that level of granularity when you need to onboard everyone. And one thing to think about is metrics are never going to be enough. At the end of the day, it's going to be the people that you have to embark in your business, your stakeholders, your investors too, and it's the behavior change we'll have to bring on board to make that happen. I like to say that metrics don't make policies, but policies need metrics. I mean, the metrics are just like they're an element to kind of make change happen, but they're not the change in itself. And so then we really have to think about how do you design metrics or tools that embark the behavior change. And I think we still have a lot of work to do there, just because it's still fairly abstract, even though there's more and more climate change events happening and hitting everyone. It's still fairly abstract to understand the level of change that needs to happen. I mean, globally, we need to have emissions by 2030 from a 2000 approximately timeframe. This is like enormous. I mean, I said Schneider has to reduce its carbon footprint by a quarter in 10 years. So if you factor in growth, it's, we hope, a lot more from a carbon intensity perspective. And that is really hard to grasp, kind of that level of change that's required from everyone, from our designers, from our engineers, from our marketers, from our salespeople, from all of our stakeholders, our distributors. And that's where I hope we can work more on those metrics. Like how do you create metrics that work for people?
And Chris, can I just jump in to add to something that Vanessa mentioned, which I fully agree with everything she's just said. I think one of the key things is not just the metric, right, but it's the awareness and you mentioned, Vanessa, the word transparency, right? I think that is so critical. And like two examples come to my mind of work that we've done with clients. But on one hand, it's as simple as we've been working with one client who has been trying to transition their fleet. Now, what we started doing with that client is first kind of just getting an awareness of their fleet emissions, where these vehicles were going and where they were stopping and idling. And idling is a huge, huge problem. And that's a huge behavioral thing, right? But being able to present that data back to those guys driving the fleet is actually really empowering, because you start realizing, oh, wow, okay, yes, I shouldn't just sit in the vehicle 15 minutes before my shift ends, like, a mile away from the depot, because actually that's not wonderful. And someone's going to be starting to track that and starting to measure that, right? So whatever the kind of the baseline was, giving you the visibility that that's what you're doing, and then the awareness that someone's actually watching that now, empowers that person to change their behavior, right? So it doesn't come obviously overnight, but there's a huge aspect of that. And that's, maybe that person was super aware of the overall environmental commitments of the firm, but didn't really think their personal behaviors were really going to impact it. But actually that's huge, right? And you add that up over however many people, it kind of grows fast. And so that's like on one dimension, right? And then another example on a bigger scale, this is a company that has a lot of really hard to abate emissions. So Professor Sachs also talked about, clean power grid, and then we focus on the industrial stuff. Well, actually, you need to start focusing on the industrial stuff now if you're going to get to even the 2045 goals, right? Even if we're thinking that far out, because so much innovation is needed in the way that we manufacture, in the way that all of it, the whole process, right? We're not just talking about kind of the energy component that goes in. One of the things that we did with one of those companies was actually like thinking about the different assets. They're the ones that know the plants. They're the ones that know the processes themselves, and empowering them to actually innovate from bottom up, right? Gives them the ability to say, okay, this high level net zero target that my company has, it's abstract. It doesn't mean very much, but actually if I'm at the local level at that plant and I'm thinking, how can I do this differently and still, produce what I need to produce? Like that is super empowering. And then you can actually create a little bit of competition between the assets, and who doesn't like a little bit of friendly competition, right? And then it bubbles up that way. But I think awareness, transparency, and empowerment are really kind of key tools that we can start using to enable some of that behavioral change that Vanessa was talking to.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think that one of the key pieces in there is that empowerment piece. I think that's one that often gets missed, right? So we might give them the visibility to it. We might say, hey, come up with ideas, and then expect them to do all of the same things that they were already doing anyway. And if as leaders, we're not creating the space for them to be able to drive that innovation, then it makes it far harder for our frontline folks to step up and engage on that front. We are getting a couple of questions in already, so I would encourage folks to continue to submit those. You also have in Zoom the ability to upvote any of the questions that you particularly find interesting, so I encourage folks to participate in those areas. One final piece that I'd mentioned here before we transition to some of the questions that were submitted in advance, but just I think points that both of you had raised on that idea of change. I think Joel McHauer was recently interviewed for a podcast, and his whole thing was change. The reason why we're having trouble is because change, we all love it as a noun, and no one likes it really as a verb, let alone to be the one that needs to change. And so if we can do that in a way that fosters it, like, hey, this is about being better. This is like, it's a little competitive spirit. I have the resources, I'm supported to make this change. It becomes a lot more feasible, a lot more viable. So thinking about some of the questions that came in advance, thinking about the development of that roadmap that Professor Sachs mentioned, what should industries or what in particular, what industries and what stakeholders should take the lead in starting that process, right? So if we're thinking about whether that's at the global level, at the federal level, at a community, local level, is this just a local chamber of commerce convening all of everybody, or should we be expecting particular stakeholders to take more of a lead there? If we need a plan, who should be the ones, besides academia, who should be the ones that we would look to really lean in and help create the plan and figure out the metrics after the plan?
I'm happy to jump in, but I don't know if the question is more about any plan or about the plan for America. And so
the plan
I would
for America
say,
for decarbonizing,
yeah.
this transition. Yeah.
So the plan for America, maybe Carolyn, let you jump on that one, given your experience in convening particularly around the clusters, industrial clusters. But I mean, I would say any plan from a corporate perspective that can feed into hopefully that country plan. There's a couple kind of must and kind of maybe considerations. Any plan will be iterative. That's you just mentioned change. That's the interesting part about what we're designing, is that we've never done it before. I don't think anyone can exactly say what is the plan to go to a 2050 net zero globally for any type of industry and nail it with like the exact cost. I mean, yes, we have a lot of mobilization, we have a lot of marginal abatement cost curve, so it will need to be iterative. It will need to be influenced by kind of how technology is evolving, how policy is evolving, how customers or how consumers are evolving, and that's where there could be a huge driver that's maybe under tap today for sure. But I don't think the lack of a precision in the plan and the lack of precision in the data we're having today is an excuse for not starting a plan. Internally, I use that phrase very often with my team, and maybe they're bored with it, but I say I want data that's just good enough. And I know maybe to auditors, I say something different, but it's with carbon accounting, I don't know what's good enough. And with biodiversity, I don't know what's good enough. We don't even know how the interaction of the species, and we barely know with Earth, really, frankly. It's just, I think we have to be just humble when talking about climate change and biodiversity by just knowing how little we know, but just knowing that any interaction can be a lot more massive and a lot more have a lot more exponential impact that we assume it is. And that's where it's also very hard, because we tend to think, I mean, all right, at least I can speak for myself, but to think linearly, 1 + 1 = 2, like very simple. But like with climate change and with biodiversity, it's really like this different system, and it's much more exponential. And I think we have to just make sure that action is almost, it needs to be parallel to data. It can be like data first, then action.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I mean, I fully agree with that. I think maybe two points that I would add. One is like there to Vanessa's point of like, we've not done this before. We haven't done this before, for sure. We're all on slightly different pathways to getting there as well. And I think there's huge power in learning from other countries as they go through this, right? So the system value framework that I mentioned, we've done like 14 countries now. And Denmark is one example. They are looking to get to 90% carbon free by 2030. And sorry, 70% reduction, 70% by 2030, and 90% variable renewable energy. That is like an insane amount of flexibility that is required in the system to be able to manage that, right? And that doesn't just mean renewables. Like you have to be able to have backup power, right? Like you have to be able to whether that's batteries or hydrogen or, but that there has to be something. So there's a lot that we're going to learn by watching countries like that. Okay, Denmark's a lot smaller than the US, but it's really important. And then I think the second point that I would say is, if we think about the US and the plan, I don't know that we're ever going to get to a plan for the US, to be honest. It's a huge, huge country. But what I think we can do is think more at a sort of regional level and think about plans at that level and how we better collaborate between the public and private sector. And there, I think there's a lot to learn from other parts of the world as well. Vanessa mentioned in the industrial side in particular, but we've been doing some work around this concept of industrial clusters, right? So really thinking about how industry works together to get to net zero. And it's not just together in terms of the private sector working together cross sector, which is important, but it's actually public and private sector stakeholders coming together to really decarbonize heavy industry. And often heavy industry happens to be kind of co-located, right? So there's actually a lot of value in them working together in terms of cost efficiencies, in terms of everything you can get. You can kind of create some really innovative circular concepts by working together in kind of specific areas. And I think the IIJA in particular is encouraging that, right? And that has been a lot of also, like they signed the bill, right? But then there's been a lot of work back and forth between the DOE and other governments, energy departments across the world. The UK is one in particular that I know has been very, very open about kind of sharing some of their lessons learned. But to really say, well, how do you actually use those dollars effectively, and how do you multiply those dollars by getting the private sector on board and getting some of that collaboration? And the industrial side of it is super critical, right? So really thinking about how the public sector comes to the table to do that, and how you put in place the right high level kind of metrics, right? So social justice is critical. Professor Sachs talked about that. 40% of the funds in the IIJA is expected to go to disadvantaged communities. That means that those players that are applying for those funds need to have a plan, right? It's not just we're going to decarbonize and so give us money to build our hydrogen hub over here. It's actually, we're going to do it in the most just, effective way possible by really bringing those stakeholders to the table. And they're a part of the plan. They're not just an afterthought. They're actually helping to architect the plan, right? So I think by enabling some of that, you can create regional plans. And maybe that's as good as we're going to get for the US. But I think to echo Vanessa's word or kind of message, I wouldn't wait on that overarching plan, because I think there's a lot we can get from the local action. I think we want to, try to kind of make sure that we are able to kind of measure, are we going fast enough, far enough? And I think we know that today the answer to that is no, but we need action, right? That's been the message at COP27. That's been the message at the G20. Everybody knows we need action. So let's not just go into too much of a dark room to start mapping out a plan. Let's keep the momentum going.
Right. No, exactly.
And also,
go ahead, Vanessa.
No, sorry, just to add also on what you said, Carolyn, I think you said it very well. And I said we don't know what it takes to go to precisely, but I think all we mentioned are things that exist and that we know. Like we know enough of the technologies we need to deploy. And you've talked a lot about the grid decarbonization. And obviously that's the first kind of building block that we need to focus on. And that's also Professor Sachs talked about decarbonization in the US grid by 2035, which is, there's still a plan to be defined, but I would say there's more advanced on that plan. And so we know kind of what are the ingredients that get us to net zero. It's more like the precision of the plan and the type of investment at every, in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, the type of precision that maybe any corporate would like in any business plan is not there yet. But we have enough, I think, to really deliver at least on the 2030 targets, and what the IRA has put on the table. Most of the academia, in fact, models are showing that it could lead to a 40% reduction of emissions by 2030. So it's still short from the 50% that were targeted, but it's close, and there's maybe like just these extra steps that are needed to get to the 50%. But then it's always the last mile. It's the hardest with climate change. And it's going to be like, okay, what's next after the 2030?
Yeah. So I want to be mindful of time. I know that when our Outlook systems created a lot of these invites and sent them out to people to say like, hey, make sure to book these times. I believe it buffered in there a 10-minute sanity buffer for folks. So we may not end exactly at the 50, but we'll try and wrap up here in a last question or two. I think we've addressed most of the questions that came in here in advance. So very glad on that part. Just some wrap-ups, Lou, if you can help me with dropping some resources in that have come up here in the last bits of conversation from our panelists as far as regional roadmaps. That is something that, as an example, that Professor Sachs had mentioned around the Marshall Plan for Middle America, that the center helped author the roadmap on 2 years ago now at this point, back in 2020 in November. And so we're looking at that. There have been a number of other reports that have come out and other blueprints and roadmaps. And so there's lots of interest in this space. And I think to the point from the panel that this is the decade for action. Let's start going. Let's not have analysis paralysis hold up any action on that front. There was another piece in there around setting science-based targets, and that's a target, that's not the plan, so you need to come up with a plan after that. But for folks that they haven't even started yet, especially the small and medium enterprises that are part of many companies' supply chains, would encourage folks to check out the SME Climate Hub, and particularly have an event coming up here in the next bit that should be focused on helping folks get started in that journey. And I know at the center, we're focusing on resources for, okay, great, you've got a target. Now, how do you come up with a plan for those that don't have the bandwidth to have an internal Chris helping run things, or to maybe all the resources to partner with Accenture fully, but they still need a plan. So how might we help them move forward on that front? But thinking about, as we wrap up here for today, Caroline and Vanessa, what action items do you recommend, right? What's the call to action? How do we take all this information that we've heard and do something productive with it come Monday?
I think I'll kick off, and this may not be a perfect answer, but I mean, I think it is like almost, it's overwhelming, right? How much there is now out there. But I think that there's a lot out there, but there are a few kind of real standards or frameworks in place that are that everyone is rallying around, right? So Vanessa mentioned SBTI, the GHG protocol. Like, I think for a small company, or I would start with some of those kind of ones that are recognized and that everyone is rallying around, and really think, again, try to think as much as possible at like the local level, whether that's the company and the environment that they're in, or more broadly than even if it's kind of, if they're more on a regional or global stage, just try and kind of put yourself into that context and look around you at what the other players are, see who you can collaborate with, and see how you can make a bigger difference. And this goes to individuals, to be honest, as well, right? Like how you can just make a bigger difference at your level, right? Whatever your context is. I think that conversation is a key part of that. This is a small example, but I think it's super powerful. So I live in California. I'm in Arizona at the moment at my sister's, and my sister does not work in this space, but she's very interested in sustainability and clean energy. And she has kids as well, which I think often is a turning point for a lot of people. Anyway, she organized a local session with people here to talk about and share ideas about what everyone can do. And she's got a ton of people signed up for composting, and little actions that are actually really significant. And to Vanessa's point about kind of the incremental steps or the pieces that are missing, like from the 40 to the 50, like that is going to be, those types of actions are going to be critical to getting us over the line, right? So really that broad mobilization. So although it can be daunting and overwhelming, I think there are some core kind of frameworks that we can rally against and around. And then I think just being open to collaboration, to talking. This is hard. No one's, we've not done this in this way. This is broad scale transformation. We need to all work together to get there. So really thinking that everyone is empowered to be a part of it is going to be critical.
Yeah, I would echo, and I know we're at time, so I'll keep it short, but I would definitely echo what you're saying about empowerment, and also that level of transformation over a relatively short period of time is definitely unprecedented, at least according to Vaclav Smil and a number of historians. And it's I think I'm kind of an activist optimist. It's just, I feel like if we maybe feel people can do and feel like they're all going to be pioneers or kind of trailblazers in trying to solve the problems we have to solve ahead of us, then maybe people are more excited, because it's not just, you're facing kind of a dead end. It's more like, let's try to jump this over the hedge together. So I don't know. I think we have to make it exciting. This is the greatest opportunity of our generation. And I think we have to, we can, but we also have to. And so let's make as much as we can of the can before the we have to.
Awesome. Well, Thank you sincerely, panelists. And we did also drop a resource in there from Project Drawdown. Their references around climate solutions at work is a really great way to start thinking about how can I, in my role in HR, in procurement, in government relations, in whatever, how do I make this as part of my daily job wherever I might happen to be? What are the small actions that individually we can take that can help make a big difference and really own the sustainable journey of our business going forward? With that, thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Thank you, audience, for leaning in and joining in the conversation. Thank you, team, that helped make all of this happen. And with that, wishing everyone happy holidays for the days ahead. And we will catch you next time at the next gathering with the Center for Sustainable Business. Take care, everybody. Thank you all.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.